The notification came in while I was still at my desk. Transaction approved. I almost ignored it. Almost. It was late. The office was nearly empty, just the hum of fluorescent lights and the faint tapping of someone typing across the room. I had stayed late again, trying to finish a campaign before the weekend. My promotion had only been official for 3 days, and I already felt like I had something to prove. But something about the amount made me pause. It wasn't small. It wasn't ours. I opened the banking app slowly, my fingers suddenly cold against the screen. The transaction was from our joint account. A large payment. Clean. Precise. Repeated. Not the first one. I scrolled. There were more. Dozens of them. All going to the same place. Same routing number. Same quiet, hidden pattern. My chest tightened. Because I knew one thing instantly. We were not supposed to have that kind of money. My name is Natalie Harper. I'm 36 years old, and until that moment, I believed I understood the man I married. Evan and I had been together for 10 years. Married for 8. We built everything from the ground up, or at least, that's what I told myself. We weren't rich. We weren't struggling either. Just careful, calculated, responsible. Or so I thought. 3 days earlier, I had gotten the promotion I'd been working toward for years. Senior Strategy Lead. A title that came with long hours, more pressure, and finally, the kind of salary that could change things for us. I had been excited. Proud. Relieved. Evan wasn't. Maybe don't tell people right away, he had said that night, standing in the kitchen with his arms crossed. His voice was calm, but something underneath it felt tight. Why? I had asked, confused. He shrugged. I just don't want it to become a thing. You know how people are. But I knew what he meant. He didn't want it to be about him. At the time, I told myself it was normal. That some men just needed time to adjust. That love meant being patient. So I didn't celebrate. I didn't tell my parents. I didn't even post about it. I made myself smaller to keep the peace. And now I was staring at transactions that didn't make sense. A quiet pattern of money leaving our account. Not random. Not accidental. Intentional. My heart started beating faster as I clicked into the details. The recipient name wasn't familiar. Not a company. Not a service. A person. Or maybe a property. I leaned back in my chair, suddenly aware of how loud the silence around me felt. Had I missed this before? Or had I not wanted to see it? Because the truth was, there had been other things. Small things. Easy to explain away at the time. Late nights that didn't quite match his stories. Phone calls he took in another room. The way he had started asking more questions about my income lately. Specific ones. Too specific. I swallowed hard. And for the first time in years, a thought crossed my mind that I couldn't ignore. What if we weren't struggling at all? What if he just wanted me to believe we were? And more importantly, where was our money really going? I didn't close the app right away. I couldn't. The numbers stayed on the screen, almost mocking me. Clean. Organized. Intentional. There was something deeply unsettling about how consistent the transfers were. Same day each month. Same amount. No variation. Like a bill. But not one I recognized. I zoomed in on the details again, forcing myself to slow down. Maybe there was a simple explanation. Maybe it was something obvious I was missing. Insurance? Investment? A loan? But why wouldn't I know about it? Evan and I had always talked about money. At least, that's what I believed. We planned budgets together. Reviewed expenses. Made decisions as a team. Or maybe I thought we did. A strange heaviness settled in my chest. I opened our shared expense sheet, the one I updated every Sunday morning with coffee and quiet determination. Every dollar we spent was there. Groceries. Utilities. Rent. Subscriptions. Even small things, like takeout or last-minute Uber rides. I had built that system. I trusted it. And yet none of these payments were listed. Not one. I stared at the screen, feeling something shift inside me. This wasn't an oversight. This was hidden. My first instinct was to text him. Hey, what is this transfer? Simple. Direct. Normal. But my fingers hovered over the keyboard, frozen. Because something stopped me. A memory. 2 weeks ago. Late evening. I had walked into the living room quietly, thinking he was on a work call. His back was turned to me, his voice low, almost careful. I told you, I'll handle it. Just give me time. There was a pause. No, she doesn't know. And she doesn't need to. I remember standing there for a second longer than I should have. Long enough to feel something tighten in my stomach. When he turned and saw me, he smiled too quickly. Just work stuff, he said. I nodded. I always nodded. Back then, I didn't push. Now, sitting alone in the dim office, that moment replayed in my head with a completely different meaning. She doesn't know. The words echoed. I looked back at the transactions. Same amount. Same account. Every month. This wasn't new. This had been happening for a while. Maybe years. A cold realization crept in slowly, like something I didn't want to fully see yet. What else didn't I know? I minimized the app and stared at my reflection in the dark screen for a moment. I looked tired. Not just physically. Something deeper. Like a version of myself that had been trying too hard for too long. Trying to keep everything balanced. Trying to be understanding. Trying not to make things difficult. Had that made me blind? My phone buzzed again. A message from Evan. Are you still at the office? I stared at his name longer than necessary. Then another message appeared. Don't stay too late. My chest tightened again. For years, those messages had felt caring. Safe. Familiar. Now they felt controlled. Measured. Like he was checking something. Or someone. I typed back slowly. You're finishing up. I didn't mention the transfers. Not yet. Because for the first time, I had the unsettling feeling that if I asked the wrong question too soon, he would already have an answer ready. And I wasn't sure I wanted to hear the version of the truth he had prepared. Not before I found my own. I left the office later than usual that night, but I didn't feel the satisfaction that normally came with finishing a long day. Instead, there was a quiet, persistent tension sitting somewhere beneath my ribs, like something unresolved that refused to settle no matter how much I tried to rationalize it. The city felt different as I walked to my car. The streets were the same, the lights glowing softly against the dark pavement, people moving past me with their own lives and their own concerns. Nothing had changed. And yet, everything felt slightly off, like I was looking at a familiar place through a distorted lens. I kept replaying the numbers in my head. The amounts. The dates. The pattern. It didn't feel random, and that was the part one couldn't ignore. Random mistakes can be explained. Patterns cannot. Patterns mean intention, planning, repetition. And repetition meant time. A lot of time. By the time I reached our apartment, I had already decided that I wasn't going to confront Evan yet. Not because I was afraid of the answer, but because I had a growing suspicion that whatever he would tell me wouldn't be the full truth. And for the first time in our marriage, I realized that I didn't want reassurance. I wanted facts. The apartment was quiet when I stepped inside, but I could hear the low sound of the television from the living room. Evan was home. That alone wasn't unusual, but tonight it made something in me tense up. "Hey," he called out casually when he heard the door. "Hey," I replied, forcing my voice to sound normal as I slipped off my shoes and placed my bag down by the wall. He was sitting on the couch, scrolling through his phone, one arm resting along the back like he always did. Everything about him looked familiar, comfortable, unchanged. That was almost the most unsettling part. "How was your day?" he asked without looking up. "Long," I said. "Yours?" "Same," he replied, finally glancing at me with a small, practiced smile. "Nothing exciting." "Nothing exciting." I nodded, walking past him toward the kitchen, but I could feel his eyes linger on me for just a second longer than usual. It was subtle. Almost nothing. But tonight, I noticed everything. I poured myself a glass of water, trying to steady my thoughts, but my mind was already moving ahead of me, connecting details I had ignored before. There had been changes. Small ones. Gradual enough that I hadn't questioned them. He had become more careful with his phone over the past year, always turning the screen away slightly, always keeping it within reach. He had started taking occasional calls outside, saying the reception was better there. At the time, I hadn't thought twice about it. Now, every one of those moments felt like a piece of something larger. "You okay?" he asked from the living room. I turned back slightly. "Yeah. Just tired." He studied me for a moment, like he was trying to read something beneath the surface. "You've been working a lot lately," he said. "Don't burn yourself out." There was something about the way he said it that didn't feel entirely like concern. It felt measured. Almost strategic. "I'm fine," I said, a little more firmly than I intended. He nodded slowly, but his gaze lingered again before he looked back at his phone. I leaned against the counter, gripping the edge just slightly, and for the first time, I allowed myself to ask a question I had been avoiding all evening. What if this wasn't just about money? What if the money was just the surface of something much deeper? Because people don't hide things like that for no reason. And suddenly, the thought that had been forming in the back of my mind became impossible to ignore. If he was sending money somewhere every month, then someone was receiving it. That thought didn't leave me the entire night, no matter how hard I tried to push it aside and pretend everything was still normal. I moved through almost. We had dinner together like we always did, sitting across from each other at the small table near the window. The city lights reflected faintly on the glass, creating a calm, almost peaceful backdrop that didn't match the tension slowly building inside me. Evan talked about something work-related, a minor issue with a client, his tone steady and controlled. I nodded at the right moments. Asked a few questions. Even smiled once or twice. From the outside, nothing had changed. But inside, every word he said felt filtered, measured, incomplete. At one point, his phone lit up on the table between us. Just for a second. A notification. No sound, just a brief glow. His hand moved faster than I had ever seen before. He flipped it over immediately. Face down. The motion was smooth, almost automatic, like something practiced. I felt something drop inside me. "You're quiet tonight," he said, looking at me more carefully now. "Just tired," I repeated, keeping my voice even. He studied me for a moment longer, then nodded, but I could tell he wasn't entirely convinced. The air between us shifted slightly, becoming tighter, more fragile. After dinner, he offered to clean up, which wasn't unusual, but tonight even that felt different. Like he was trying to maintain a rhythm, keep everything predictable. Control the environment. Control me. I went to the bedroom, sat on the edge of the bed, and stared at nothing for a while. My mind kept circling the same questions, but now they were sharper, more specific. Who was receiving that money? And why did it feel like I wasn't supposed to find out? I lay back, staring at the ceiling, trying to piece things together in a way that made sense, but every explanation I came up with led to the same uncomfortable conclusion. He had been hiding something for a long time. And not something small. When he finally came into the room, the lights were off except for the faint glow from the street outside. He moved quietly, like he didn't want to disturb me, even though I was clearly still awake. "You coming to bed?" he asked softly. "I'm already here," I said. He let out a small breath, almost like a laugh, and got under the covers beside me. For a few minutes, neither of us spoke. Then he reached for my hand. It was something he used to do often, especially in the early years of our marriage. A small, grounding gesture. Familiar. Comforting. Tonight, it felt different. His hand was warm, steady. Mine wasn't. "You've seemed distant lately," he said quietly. The words caught me off guard. Distant. I almost laughed at the irony, but instead I swallowed it down. "I've just been focused on work," I replied. "That promotion, it's a lot, right?" He continued, his tone careful again. "Yes," I said simply. There was a pause. Then he added, "We don't have to change anything, you know. We're doing fine the way we are." My chest tightened. "We're doing fine." The words echoed in my head, colliding with the image of those transactions. Fine didn't include secret payments. Fine didn't include hidden accounts. I turned my head slightly to look at him, but in the darkness, I could only make out the outline of his face. "Evan," I said slowly, choosing each word with care, "are we okay financially?" He didn't answer immediately. It was only a second. Maybe less. But I felt it. That hesitation. "Of course we are," he said finally, his voice calm, almost too calm. "Why would you even ask that?" I looked back up at the ceiling, my heart beating just a little faster now. Because I had already seen the answer. He just didn't know it yet. I didn't sleep much that night, even though I kept my eyes closed and my breathing steady, pretending everything was fine. My mind refused to slow down, circling the same thoughts again and again, each time adding a new detail I hadn't fully processed before. It wasn't just the transfers anymore. It was the timing. The secrecy. The way he had answered my question. Or rather, the way he hadn't. By morning, the unease had settled into something more structured, more focused. It wasn't panic anymore. It was clarity, and that somehow felt even more dangerous. Because clarity meant I couldn't ignore it. Evan left before I did, as he usually did on weekdays. He kissed my cheek on his way out, the gesture so routine that I almost responded automatically, but something inside me held back just enough to notice it. It felt rehearsed. "Don't forget, we have dinner with my parents this weekend," he said as he grabbed his keys. "I remember," I replied. He nodded, gave me a quick smile, and left. The door clicked shut, and the silence that followed felt heavier than usual. I stood there for a moment, listening, making sure he was really gone. Then I moved. Not quickly. Not nervously. Deliberately. I picked up my phone and opened the banking app again, this time with a different mindset. I wasn't just reacting anymore. I was looking. Studying. The transfers weren't labeled in any helpful way, but the consistency gave me something to work with. Same account. Same pattern. Same precision. I copied the routing number into a notes app and stared at it for a moment, as if it might suddenly explain itself. It didn't. But it gave me direction. I went to my laptop, opened a browser, and hesitated for just a second before typing it in. Nothing obvious came up at first. Just standard financial institution information. But then I noticed something else in the transaction details I hadn't focused on the night before. A reference line. Short. Subtle. Easy to miss. But it was there. I zoomed in, reading it more carefully now. A name. Or at least part of one. It wasn't complete, but it was enough to make my stomach tighten. Because it wasn't a company. And it wasn't someone I recognized. Which meant one thing. This was personal. I leaned back in my chair, trying to keep my thoughts organized, but they were already moving faster than I could control. If it was personal, then why hide it? And if he was hiding it, what exactly was he afraid I would find? I glanced around the apartment, suddenly aware of how much of our life existed in shared spaces, shared accounts, shared decisions. At least, that's what I had believed. Now it felt like I had been living in a version of reality that was carefully edited. And I had never questioned who was doing the editing. My eyes moved back to the laptop screen. The partial name still sat there, quiet but heavy with implication. I whispered it under my breath once, testing how it felt. It didn't feel familiar. But it didn't feel random either. And that was enough. Because now I wasn't just asking where the money was going. I was starting to ask who it was going to. I spent the rest of that morning trying to act like everything was normal, but the truth was, nothing felt normal anymore. Every routine movement, making coffee, checking emails, getting ready for work, felt slightly disconnected, as if I was performing a version of my life instead of actually living it. The partial name stayed in my mind. It followed me into the car, into the office, into every quiet moment between tasks. I tried to focus on work, on deadlines, on conversations that required my full attention, but my thoughts kept slipping back to the same place. That name. or what I could see of it. By lunchtime, I gave up pretending I could ignore it. I locked my office door under the excuse of needing uninterrupted time and pulled up the transaction details again on my computer. This time, I looked closer. Slower. More carefully. The reference line wasn't long, but there was something else I hadn't noticed before, an abbreviation at the end. 2 letters. Subtle. Easy to overlook. But not meaningless. I copied everything into a search bar and waited. At first, the results were scattered and irrelevant. A few directories. Old listings. Nothing that connected clearly. Then, buried a few links down, something caught my attention. A property listing. My stomach tightened instantly. I clicked on it before I could second-guess myself. The page loaded slowly, like it was dragging out the moment on purpose. When the image finally appeared, I leaned closer to the screen without even realizing it. It was a house. Not extravagant. Not something that would immediately stand out. But it was well maintained. Clean. Quiet. The kind of place someone lived in long term. The kind of place someone called home. I scrolled down. There was an address. Partial ownership information. And then, that name again. More complete this time. Still not fully detailed, but enough to confirm one thing. This wasn't random. This wasn't a company. This was real. I sat back slowly, my heart beating harder now, each pulse echoing louder than the last. A house. He had been sending money regularly. The amounts matched what I was seeing. It didn't take much to connect the two. Mortgage. The word formed in my mind before I could stop it. I felt a cold wave move through me. Because if he was paying a mortgage, then it meant something very specific. He wasn't just hiding money. He was building something. Somewhere else. For someone else. I stared at the image of the house again, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but the more I looked, the less it felt like a coincidence and the more it felt like a reality I had never been meant to uncover. A second life. That was the thought that finally surfaced. Not fully formed. Not yet proven. But impossible to ignore. My phone buzzed on the desk, pulling me back for a second. A message from Evan. How's your day going? I looked at his name on the screen, then back at the image of the house. For a moment, the two realities existed side by side. The man I had built my life with. And the life he might have been building without me. I typed a response slowly. Busy. Yours? A few seconds passed. Same. Just work. Just work. I almost laughed, but the sound caught somewhere in my throat. Because now I wasn't just questioning his honesty. I was starting to question everything. And the most unsettling part wasn't what I had already found. It was the growing realization that this was only the beginning. I tried to convince myself to wait. To slow down, to gather more information, to not jump to conclusions based on something that still, technically, could have an explanation. But the truth was, I already felt the shift inside me. Something had changed. And I couldn't go back to not knowing. By the end of the workday, the idea had settled firmly in my mind, growing heavier with every passing hour until it became impossible to ignore. I needed to see the house. Not online. Not through filtered images and partial data. In person. The decision felt impulsive, but at the same time, it didn't. It felt like the only logical next step in a situation that had already crossed every boundary of normal. I left the office earlier than usual, telling my assistant I wasn't feeling well. That part, at least, wasn't a lie. There was a tight pressure in my chest that hadn't gone away since the night before. The drive was longer than I expected. 40 minutes outside the city, into quieter neighborhoods where the streets were wider, the traffic thinner, and everything felt just a little too calm. I followed the GPS directions with a strange sense of detachment, as if I was watching someone else make these choices. As if I could still stop. But I didn't. When I finally turned onto the street, my hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel. The houses here all looked similar at first glance, clean, spaced out, with small front yards and carefully maintained driveways. Normal. Completely normal. I slowed down as I approached the address, my eyes scanning the numbers almost automatically until I saw it. The house. The same one from the listing. There was no dramatic moment. No sudden realization. Just a quiet, heavy confirmation. It existed. And it was real. I parked a little further down the street, not wanting to draw attention, and sat there for a moment, staring at it through the windshield. My heartbeat felt louder again, steady but insistent. The curtains were partially drawn. A car was parked in the driveway. Not Evan's. At least, not the one he drove every day. That didn't mean anything. Or maybe it meant everything. I wasn't sure anymore. A light turned on inside the house, visible through the front window, and I instinctively leaned back slightly, as if that small movement could somehow hide me. Then I saw movement. A figure passed by the window. Too quick to make out clearly. But unmistakably there. Someone was home. Of course someone was home. That was the whole point, wasn't it? This wasn't an empty investment. This wasn't a forgotten property. This was a life. I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry, as a new thought pushed its way to the surface. How often had he been here? How many times had he driven this exact route, maybe telling me he was working late or stuck in meetings? The pieces were starting to connect faster now, forming patterns I hadn't allowed myself to see before. And then, the front door opened. My breath caught instantly. A woman stepped outside. She looked comfortable. That was the first thing I noticed. Not surprised. Not temporary. Comfortable. Like she belonged there. She walked down the small path toward the driveway, glancing briefly toward the street, and for a split second, I froze, terrified that she might notice me. But her gaze passed over my car without stopping. To her, I was just another vehicle. Just another stranger. I watched as she opened the car door, paused for a moment, then looked back at the house with a small, almost absent-minded smile. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't exaggerated. It was familiar. The kind of smile you don't think about. The kind you give when something already feels like yours. My chest tightened painfully. Because in that moment, I realized something I hadn't been ready to admit before. This wasn't new. This wasn't recent. This had been going on long enough for it to feel normal. And the worst part wasn't just that he had lied. It was that he had built something real somewhere else. I should have left. The moment I saw her, the moment that quiet realization settled into something heavier, something undeniable, I should have started the car and driven away. That would have been the reasonable thing to do. But I didn't move. I stayed exactly where I was, my hands still resting on the steering wheel, my eyes fixed on the house as if looking away would somehow make me lose whatever truth was about to reveal itself. The woman got into her car but didn't drive off immediately. Instead, she sat there for a moment, adjusting something inside, completely unaware of the storm she had just set in motion in someone else's life. In mine. I watched her carefully, studying every small movement, every detail I could catch from a distance, trying to understand something that didn't yet fully make sense. Then something shifted. The front door opened again. This time, my entire body went rigid before I even saw who it was. Because somehow, I already knew. Evan stepped outside. For a second, my brain refused to process it, as if denying the reality right in front of me could still protect me from what it meant. But there he was, unmistakable, familiar in a way that suddenly felt. He wasn't dressed like he was coming from work. No suit. No laptop bag. No signs of the long day he had texted me about just an hour earlier. He looked relaxed. At ease. Like he belonged there just as much as she did. My chest tightened so sharply that I had to remind myself to breathe. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a coincidence. This was real. I watched as he walked down the same path she had taken just moments before, his movements unhurried, natural, practiced. When he reached the car, she rolled down the window slightly, and he leaned in just enough for me to see the angle of his body shift. Then, he smiled. Not the polite, distant smile he sometimes gave me when he was distracted. Not the tired one at the end of a long day. This one was different. It was warm. Easy. Intimate. And then he kissed her. It wasn't quick. It wasn't accidental. It was familiar. Like something they had done 100 times before. I felt something inside me crack, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a quiet, irreversible way that left no room for denial. Every explanation I had tried to hold on to collapsed in that single moment. There was no business partner. No distant relative. No harmless reason. This was exactly what it looked like. I don't remember deciding to reach for my phone. My hands moved on their own, almost mechanically, as if part of me had already understood that I would need proof, not for him, not even for anyone else, but for myself. Because some part of me still couldn't believe it. I opened the camera and zoomed in as much as I could without drawing attention. My fingers trembled slightly, but I held the frame steady enough. Him. Her. The house behind them. One picture. Then another. I lowered the phone slowly, my heart pounding so hard it almost hurt. And for a moment, everything went completely quiet inside me. Not calm. Not peace. Just silence. The kind that comes right before something changes forever. Because now I didn't just suspect the truth. I had seen it. And there was no going back. I don't remember driving home. I know I did. I know I followed the same roads, stopped at the same lights, turned into the same parking lot. But it all felt distant, like I was moving through something thick and unreal, where every sound was muted and every movement slightly delayed. My hands were steady on the wheel. Too steady. Like my body had decided to function on its own while the rest of me tried to catch up with what I had just seen. Evan. That house. That woman. The images replayed in my mind, not in fragments, but in sharp, continuous detail, like a scene that refused to fade no matter how many times it looped. The way he stepped outside. The way he smiled. The way he kissed her. That was the part that stayed the longest. Because it wasn't just proof. It was intimacy. Familiarity. A kind of closeness that couldn't be explained away. By the time I walked into our apartment, the silence hit me differently than it had that morning. Before, it had felt heavy with suspicion. Now it felt hollow. Like something had already ended, even if nothing had been said yet. I set my keys down on the counter and stood there for a moment, staring at nothing in particular. Everything around me looked the same. The furniture, the lighting, the small details we had built together over the years. But none of it felt the same. Because now I knew. And knowing changes everything. I walked slowly through the apartment, my eyes catching on things I had never questioned before. His jacket hanging by the door. His shoes neatly placed underneath. The coffee mug he always used, still sitting in the sink from that morning. All of it so ordinary. And yet now, every object felt like evidence of something I didn't fully understand. Or maybe something I had never wanted to see. My phone buzzed again, pulling me out of the spiral. Another message from Evan. Running a bit late tonight. Don't wait up. I stared at the screen, my chest tightening again, but this time the feeling was different. It wasn't confusion anymore. It wasn't even shock. It was clarity. Cold. Precise. Unavoidable. Because now I knew exactly where he was. And who he was with. I typed a response, my fingers moving slowly but without hesitation. Okay. Just one word. Neutral. Calm. Controlled. Not a single hint of what I had seen. What I had felt. What I now understood. I set the phone down and let out a long breath, my mind already shifting into something new. Not panic. Not grief. Strategy. Because confronting him now, in anger, without preparation, would only give him space to deny, to twist, to manipulate the situation into something smaller than it really was. And I wasn't going to let that happen. Not anymore. I walked to the bedroom and opened the closet, my eyes scanning the shelves until they landed on a small box tucked in the corner. Documents. Financial records. Things we had organized together over the years. Or at least, things I thought we had organized together. I pulled the box out and set it on the bed, opening it carefully, almost methodically, as if I was handling something fragile. Inside were folders, neatly labeled. Taxes. Insurance. Business expenses. Everything looked structured. Controlled. Transparent. At least on the surface. I started going through them one by one, my movements slow but deliberate, my mind focused in a way it hadn't been all day. If there were more secrets, this is where they would be. And as I turned another page, scanning numbers and names that suddenly felt unfamiliar, one thought settled firmly in my mind. This wasn't just about an affair. This was bigger. Much bigger. And whatever I was about to uncover next would decide everything. I didn't sleep that night. Not even an hour. Instead, I sat cross-legged on the bedroom floor, the box of documents open before me, my eyes scanning line after line of numbers, account names, and transactions that made no sense at first. My mind struggled to catch up with what my hands were seeing. Every folder I opened felt like peeling back another layer of the life I thought we were building together. And then I found it. A bank statement. A joint account, our names on the surface, but the numbers didn't add up. Large sums disappearing every month. Transfers labeled vaguely. Utilities, expenses, payments. Except they weren't. Not to our bills. Not to suppliers. Not to anything we had ever discussed. The realization hit me like a punch to the chest. Evan had been moving money somewhere else. And the someone else wasn't hard to imagine. I traced the transactions, following them across multiple accounts, each one leading further from what I had believed was a shared future. My heart raced, my hands shook. Every dollar I thought we had saved, every sacrifice I had made, every sleepless night I had worked on that company, had been silently redirected. To her. I remember sitting back, gripping the edges of the folder so tightly my knuckles turned white. I felt rage, humiliation, disbelief, and a profound sense of betrayal all at once. And yet, amid the storm of emotions, something else emerged. Clarity. I understood now why he had reacted the way he did when I got that promotion. Why he had avoided discussions about money. Why he always seemed stressed whenever I suggested planning for our future. It wasn't because he was worried about bills or pressure at work. It was because he was hiding an entire life from me. A secret I had been funding without knowing. I found emails, too, short, polite, mundane to anyone else, but to me, they were explosive. Invitations to meetings, updates on projects, confirmations of transfers, all directed towards someone who wasn't me. I remembered his words from months ago, when I had asked about a late bank fee. Oh, it's nothing. Just a small adjustment. Don't worry about it. It wasn't nothing. It was everything. And suddenly, the whole marriage I had built in my mind, every shared dream, every promise, every sacrifice, was exposed as a lie. I sat there, the room silent except for my shallow breathing, staring at the evidence. And for the first time, I realized the truth was bigger than just hurt or heartbreak. This was a web. Carefully constructed. Years of deception, subtle manipulation, and strategic concealment. And now, I held the map of it in my hands. I wasn't a victim anymore. Not yet. But I was armed. Because knowledge is power. And I was going to use it. The moment I saw him walk through the door, I knew everything had changed. Evan's face was calm, almost too calm, like nothing could touch him. He didn't notice the box of documents spilling onto the floor, the way my hands still trembled as I held the papers. We need to talk, I said, my voice sharper than I intended. He glanced at me, then at the scattered statements. About what? He asked, too casual, too measured. I felt a rush of heat, anger, and disbelief all at once. Don't play dumb, Evan. I know. I know everything. His calm faltered for just a second, enough for me to see it. The slight tightening of his jaw, the blink that lasted a beat too long. But he recovered quickly. What are you talking about? I've seen the accounts. The transfers. The emails. Every dollar I worked for was going somewhere else. You've been funding her life while I thought we were building our own. He looked at me, eyes wide for a brief moment, but then he leaned back against the doorframe and smiled in that patronizing way that made my blood boil. Angela, you're overreacting. It's not what you think. Not what I think. Really? I shot back, my voice cracking. I designed the brand, handled the marketing, sacrificed years of my career. And you, my throat tightened. You lied. 4 years. You took my trust, my work, my life, and handed it to someone else. He shook his head slowly. Angela, it's complicated. I didn't want to hurt you. I laughed bitterly. Complicated? That's your excuse? All those nights I stayed up designing packaging, negotiating contracts, counting on us, and you were living a double life? The weight of betrayal hit harder than I ever imagined possible. Every memory of our shared dreams felt poisoned. I saw his subtle manipulations, the way he downplayed my achievements, the way he insisted on secrecy about finances, the way he made me doubt myself when I questioned him. I wanted to scream. To throw the papers at him, to shatter the glass of calm he tried to maintain. I wanted him to feel a fraction of the humiliation, the rage, the utter devastation I felt. And then I realized something. I didn't have to wait for him to apologize. I didn't have to beg for recognition or justice. I had the truth. And the truth was mine to use. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. This ends now. I'm done pretending our life was real. I'm taking control of everything, my work, my money, my decisions. You've lost your hold over me. He opened his mouth to respond, but I didn't let him. I walked past him, my head held high, the papers clutched in my hand. This was the turning point. The moment I decided that betrayal would not define me. That humiliation would not break me. That I would rise, and I would be the one in control. Because if he thought he could hide the truth forever, he was gravely mistaken. And I was just getting started. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. The sun poured through the kitchen window, lighting the papers I had left spread across the counter. Each statement, each email, each hidden transaction, it was all there. I didn't feel fear anymore. Only resolve. I poured myself a cup of coffee, sat at the table, and made a list. Not just a mental note, but a detailed, actionable plan. Step 1. Separate my finances. Step 2. Find a new apartment. Step 3. Cut all emotional ties that gave him control. I called my bank first. I need to open a new account, I told the representative. Everything that goes in there is off limits to anyone else. I could feel a small, triumphant weight lifting from my chest as I listened to the confirmation. Finally, a boundary that he could not cross. Then I started apartment hunting. Every listing I scrolled through felt like a tiny rebellion. A new space. My space. Somewhere I could breathe without the constant shadow of deceit. By the end of the day, I had scheduled viewings and packed a small bag with essentials, an emergency kit for the new life I was building. Next came the confrontation I had rehearsed endlessly in my mind. I sat him down in the living room, the scattered papers between us like evidence in a trial. This isn't negotiable, I said firmly. I'm moving out. I am separating our finances. I am reclaiming everything that is mine. Evan looked at me, confusion and anger flickering across his face, but I didn't waver. I don't care about your excuses anymore. I care about my life. Every choice I make from this point on is for me, not for the illusion you've maintained for years. I spent that night drafting letters, contacting landlords, and arranging movers. I knew the journey wouldn't be easy, but I also knew the alternative. Staying in a home built on lies was far worse. By the end of the week, I was signing the lease for a small apartment downtown, the keys warm in my hands. I transferred my finances, closed old joint accounts, and blocked his access to anything that gave him leverage. For the first time in years, I felt the exhilarating mix of fear and freedom. And as I packed the last box, I realized the magnitude of what I had accomplished. I hadn't just removed myself from a toxic situation. I had reclaimed my identity, my power, and my dignity. Every small step was a declaration. I would no longer be a silent participant in someone else's deception. The truth had hurt, but it had also liberated me. And for the first time, I could see the path forward clearly. The first night in my new apartment, I sat by the window with a cup of tea, watching the city lights flicker. Silence stretched around me, not heavy, not lonely. It was calm, intentional, mine. For the first time in years, I felt a peace that had nothing to do with anyone else. I reflected on everything that had happened. The years of hard work, the constant compromises, the silent self-doubt planted by someone who had pretended to be my partner but had been building his own secret life. I allowed myself to grieve, not just for the betrayal, but for the illusions I had held onto for so long. And then, slowly, I let it go. I picked up my phone and started reaching out to friends I had pulled away from over the years. Reconnecting with them reminded me of the life I had put on pause, the laughter, the encouragement, the genuine support that had always existed outside of my marriage. Every message I sent, every call I made, felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. Work became my anchor again. I poured my energy into projects I had neglected, into creativity I had suppressed, into goals that were entirely mine. Each success reminded me that my achievements didn't need validation from anyone who had tried to control me. I could thrive on my own, and I was doing it. And then, one quiet evening, as I was organizing my notes for a new business idea, I realized I had reached a turning point. I no longer felt anger every time I thought of him. Instead, I felt clarity, understanding, and strength. I had survived deception, humiliation, and manipulation, and I had emerged stronger. I wrote a list of lessons learned. Trust my instincts, never compromise my worth, set boundaries firmly, and always, always value myself above appearances or promises. This list wasn't a punishment. It was a roadmap for my life moving forward. For the first time in a long time, I smiled without guilt or hesitation. I had taken back control, reclaimed my dignity, and forged a life that was entirely my own. I was Natalie Harper, 36 years old, fully aware of my strength, fully capable of choosing my path, fully deserving of happiness. And in that quiet, city-lit room, I understood something essential. Betrayal could hurt, but it could also awaken resilience. And with resilience came freedom, clarity, and the unshakable knowledge that I would never again allow someone else to define my worth.